Hi there. I am Chele Roland, and this is Hoyt Richards.
Hello.
And we want to welcome you to our inaugural podcast and YouTube channel. And I say inaugural because we might be working some kinks out. This is our first episode, so bear with us, people.
That's right. Be understanding.
We just got here a few minutes ago, so just hang in there. Our podcast is titled WhaTheFlok, F-L-O-K, so we don't get dinged on that, Cult Survivor Stories. So each episode, we're going to start with a quote. So we're going to have a quote of the day. And the quote is going to tie into what we're talking about on that day. So I'll go ahead and read our quote. Is that cool, Hoyt?
Go for it. Absolutely.
I'm so bossy and long-winded already. Here I go. Our quote of the day: the mind is your guard, the heart is your maid, and the soul is your territory. Nobody else but you should have control of these. And that's a quote by Gloria Gonzalez, one of my favorites. So, hey, Hoyt, I think I'm going to join a cult.
Yeah. That's
said no one ever. Have you ever said that?
No, but people think that. They think it's something that you would be aware of before it happens, and that's not the way it works. You do join a movement. You do join a great idea.
A cause.
You grow some, but yeah, no one's like, hey, we're in a cult, come join us. That's not what ever happens.
Right. And once you're in one, you never think you're in one. And you defend it feverishly, fervently, that it is not a cult. It actually becomes part of the group's, cult's standpoint. Our dialogue is all the reasons why they are not a cult.
Absolutely.
Because everyone around them is accusing them of being in a cult. We used to have whole meetings to talk about why we were not a cult. And anything that was introduced that said we were a cult was titled spiritual pornography.
Oh, interesting.
And we were big fat sinners if we listened to that.
We were very clear that there were cults, that they did exist.
Right, us too.
But not us. And I even remember at one point when we got labeled in the media as a cult, that we actually got a book. I got a book about, the all about cults and the tenets that they kind of, and I remember reading it, but I was still at this point so brainwashed that as I'm reading it, I'm going, well, we do some of these things. I guess I can understand why people think we're a cult, but I know we're not.
Right.
So then we would have meetings basically saying, well, let's not do all this kind of cult-like behaviors, because then it would make it easier for people not to think, find out the truth that we're not a cult. So that's how caught you are in that spiral, that even though people are calling you that, you're like, no, there's no way, even when the evidence is staring you right in the face.
Right. Yeah. Well, it becomes part of your DNA to defend it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and because that word is so triggering, and I think,
right.
And I think that's always been my challenge when I introduce my story to people, which I've done thousands of times now. The moment, and I can bring it up very kind of inauspiciously, kind of like someone's talking about a theme, and I say, oh, well, that reminds me of the days when I was in a cult, and we did, this, and this, and people are like, what? Did you just say you were in a cult? And the problem, whatever way you bring it up, if I just say like, I was in a cult for 20 years, people immediately start, like, they think about Jonestown, they think about Charlie Manson, the Heaven's Gate people. So that's kind of a hole that you have to dig out of to say, yes, I was in a cult, but it wasn't as extreme as that. Like, I definitely had an extreme experience, but it's not as extreme as what the media has labeled as far as the ones you've been exposed to. Yeah. So I think that's the challenge. I actually find the better way to frame it now is to say, I had a cultic relationship with a group, because that gets someone to start critically thinking, going like, well, what do you mean? I've never heard the term cultic relationship.
Which is much different than I was in a cult.
Exactly.
Even when you said that felt better to me.
Yeah. And so then there's an inquiry, of like, well, what do you mean cultic relationship? And that's where you start to kind of, not unlike the autism spectrum, there's a spectrum between, a really extreme cult, like maybe Jonestown or one of these ones where people are dying, versus a one-on-one relationship like domestic violence or any sort of abusive relationship that we've had where you in essence have given your power and authority away to someone else and you're still seeking their love and approval, that power dynamic is the cultic dynamic. You are accepting the abuse because you are thinking it's part of either training or it's your way to get the attention or love you're looking for.
Right.
And obviously, as you move to the other side of the extreme, then you have the group involvement, the peer pressure element, and the stakes are getting much higher. Like in our group, it wasn't just one person I'm trying to get their approval of. He had painted this picture that the end of the world was coming, so the whole world lies in balance. So that's like dialing the whole thing up on steroids.
Right. Well, and I think to circle back to something you just said, and really one of our goals for even having this discussion, with the nation, the world, is to really portray that stereotype of the weak, gullible, or even dumb. I've had people tell me I would never be so dumb to be in a cult. I was in college. I was very driven. I wasn't this dumb girl.
Yeah.
So what I'm really excited about digging into is really breaking through that stereotype that you're weak or gullible or dumb. And I'm gonna say most people I come across that have been in a cult are the opposite. They are driven. They are idealistic. They are dreamers. They want to change the world. I'm telling you, it is impossible to motivate a couch potato. They make horrible cult members.
Right.
And we even, in our group, which sounds horrible, but I'm just going to say it, and you and I will get into our personal stories here in a minute, and give the listeners all the juicy details, but we would purposefully say, oh, we don't want a one or a two-tooth member, meaning people that have no teeth. It was a very offensive things to say, like, how many teeth do they have?
Right.
Because we were only going after the sharp, driven people that could change the world. Now, a cult will take anybody.
Sure.
Their doors are open.
Yeah.
Because more bodies is more momentum and more power and, more bragging rights about how big your cult is. But we definitely wanted those people that would jump on board with us to change the world.
Well, yeah, and they're better recruiters.
Way better recruiters.
Because ultimately, like you said, a cult will pretty much take anyone, once they're in recruitment phase.
Yes.
But they're targeting a certain, if you want to call it like a brand, that they think will be the best to pull more people
Our
in.
word was sharp. How sharp are they?
Okay.
Are they sharp?
Right.
I heard that word 50 times a day.
Yeah.
They better be sharp.
Yeah, and people's kind of reaction of thinking those stereotypes that you name, like someone's really gullible or naive or stupid or
don't have things going in their life or
and,
needed
and
somebody.
all of that is really, I've discovered in telling my story so many times, that's a defense mechanism, because once you get this topic out on the floor, someone's using, if that type of person's uncomfortable and all they really want to do is have you tell them this wouldn't happen to me. And the whole point I'm bringing this up is to say, actually, this can happen to anyone, because I was sitting in that same place of thinking this would never happen to me when it happened. And whenever anyone approached me and even had the courage to say, I don't know, it sounds a little culty. Are you sure? And I'd be like, screw you. You think I'd join a cult? You think? And I had all those same stereotypes embedded in my psyche. And I think that's one of the reasons we both wanted to put together a program like this. The best way to understand the mechanisms is to talk to the people who've gone through it.
Yes.
And very often the people who tell these stories or kind of are overseen telling these stories are not people that actually went through the experience. So there's a lack of understanding and unfortunately a lack of empathy for what the power dynamics, how they play out, and how you get affected, and how the dealing of trauma is a big obstacle. One of the things that I've really noticed is quite often people don't even imagine that there is really a recovery process. They think at one point you get out of this thing, everything should be fine then. And that's like talking to a soldier who went over to Afghanistan or Iraq and got severely traumatized and comes back, and you're sitting there having drinks with him at the bar, and he's having a PTSD experience, and you're like, what's the problem? There's no bullets going on, there's no guns. You have no understanding of what that person's been through. So that's why I think, telling these stories of people who've gone through it are going to be really useful to people, because by putting a face and a personality to these stories of
And a context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the context is crucial.
Yeah.
And so, because really when it comes down to it, the cultic experience breaks down into, if you think of it like 4 phases, there's kind of the recruitment and, seduction phase. That's kind of how it happens. I like to call that the perfect storm. You're usually at a point in your life where maybe you're starting to ask some questions, kind of what I would call seeker mode. And
seeking mode.
Yeah. Because if you're kind of seeing yourself as a seeker and asking questions, you want answers. And if you find someone who, from your point of view, is giving you those answers, that's a great thing. And I wish people would tell their friends and family when they experience someone going through that's great that you're in that phase, which is what normally people say. But they should also say, but be careful, because every manipulator out there will see you as a target and potentially take advantage of you.
Can I interject really quick?
Of course.
Because how old were you initially?
I was 16.
You were 16.
Yeah.
Our cults, which I'll share the name and all that with you guys later, main fishing ground was the college campuses.
Right.
I mean, we were on those campuses like white on rice. It was just, we would swarm them.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of members of my cult. We got kicked off some campuses and forbidden from going there.
For good reason, right? I'm
right.
sure.
But because college students are everything that you're saying right now, they're idealistic and they're risk takers. They're out of the house. They're like, screw you, mom and dad. I can make my own choices. That's where I was at. I'm going to show you.
Sure.
I am going to change the world. I am special.
Yeah.
So you're appealing to that, kind of narcissism they have going on in that moment.
Yeah, and it's that type of thing of where your kind of moral value system is being used against you. Your desire to want to be the better person, maybe help out the world, maybe help out your fellow man, become more spiritual, become more enlightened.
Yes.
That's how you're being manipulated, which I think is the most nasty part about it. You're basically taking the best part of someone and using it against
exploiting
themselves.
it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's wanting to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And you finally have the freedom to do it as a teenager, as a campus student.
I mean, it can happen anytime, obviously.
Right.
Anytime you're in a transition of any sort where you're trying to find new footing. Anytime I would say that you're vulnerable in the sense that you're just open to new possibilities. That's kind of where I would say the perfect storm. You have to be kind of open-minded and then unfortunately intersect with someone who can recognize that you're in that state and then manipulate you.
Correct.
And that's kind of where so the next phase is, really when you get introduced to these groups, I think the part that usually gets overlooked is, why did you stay? What did you find about it that was appealing? Like very often, I think when you hear someone saying, oh, there's a story about someone in a cult, you inherently know bad stuff has happened, because we all know bad things happen in these groups.
Right.
But what gets left off a lot sometimes is the positives, because if you don't offset the obvious negatives that are somehow inherently involved, then you start thinking anyone who gets involved with this group is some sort of, masochist, which is not accurate, because, it's just like if you want to compare the battered wife scenario, those relationships always start off great at some point, and then it devolves. Really great.
There's usually love bombing in the beginning,
and then it devolves into this whole sort of thing, and so. Obviously, that's phase 2, and then phase 3 kind of moves into, at what point did the bad things start to kind of overcome the good things, and that's when you ultimately lead to a point when you're going to finally leave. And there's only 3 ways you can leave a cult. It's either you leave on your own, like I did, I escaped, you get pulled out, like from a intervention of some sort of thing, which are challenging things to do, or you get kicked out, which can be really devastating for a person's psyche. And my friend who's coming later, Dar, who was also in Dar's Dixon, he was also in our group, and he got kicked out, and he'll talk about how devastating that was to his psyche. And then I think the most important phase is the aftermath, the recovery process. Like I said earlier, that's the part that most people are really unaware of. And that is ultimately the most crucial part, because that's where the silver lining will emerge over time.
Right.
Because you really have to move in the recovery process from being the victim, because at some point you have to just admit to yourself, I did not sign up for this. What I signed up for was very different, and I actually signed up for something really dangerous, and I thought it was great. So there's a victimization in that, and you have to identify with that initially, and from that you start to educate into the survivor mode where you
Yeah.
realize that anyone who got caught more or less in that scenario that you were would have more or less behaved the same way you did. So there's nothing to really feel shameful about. You just have to get the information to say, okay, I can learn from this. And that's where you move from into that survivor mode. And then ultimately, as you start to piecemeal through your experience of what were the good things, what were the bad things, what did I get, exposed to that actually has been validated by my life, and I actually do find that to be truthful. Or there are those things that you got influenced to believe that you're like, that's total bullshit. Like my life, there's nothing that validates that. So that's the kind of hard work. But ultimately, through that process, you start to develop a new lens on how you look at the world and you look at the world around you and you see that there's all sorts of influence and manipulation tactics going on. And you actually start to look at this experience potentially as a real badge of honor that you not only survived, but you've actually gained valuable life lessons from this. And now you can thrive. So that's really, it's the victim to the survivor to the thriver, and the people we're going to be talking to
I like that.
here.
Say that again. Victim to survivor to thriver.
So we'll be interviewing some of the thrivers, because the whole point to tell the story is to show there's actually a purpose to it. Because a lot of the programs you see about cults, it all ends and you're just depressed. You're like, God,
it's dark.
All these people got
Dark
pulled
and
into this,
twisty.
and they got really screwed over, and this evil person was managing it. And you have to kind of get into that recovery process. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't go down that road. And I think, like in my group in particular, I'd say over 90% of the people involved have never healed. And that, to me, is the most disturbing part of it.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping by starting to change the environment so that we can make these things more comfortable to talk about and realize that the power dynamics are ones that we've all experienced in our lives. Like, I don't know anyone who hasn't experienced a cultic relationship, but they've never realized that unhealthy, abusive relationship they've been in, that's the actual proper, appropriate, clinical term.
Right.
And so then in the end, we're all needing to speak the same language, and hopefully we'll be able to get that, happening with our conversations we're going to have.
Well, and I think I'm actually going to skip forward in my notes here because you just brought up a great point. Let's go ahead and read the definition of indoctrination. It's a very simple definition. The process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. Hello, who hasn't all day, every day?
Sure.
Whether it's an abusive partner, like you said, something that might seem a little culty, an extreme religion. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll jump on that. The UK government basically defines controlling behavior as a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capabilities for personal gain, and depriving the means needed for independence, resistance, and escape by regulating their everyday behavior.
Well, that was 17 years of my life right there. Thank you for recapping my life.
And so but that's not saying, like, that's just talking about normally domestic abusive relationships.
Right.
But that, you see how similar that is to the cultic experience.
It's almost identical.
And this article that I'm referencing here basically says that's how common they are. It's just with the cult, there's a group dynamic, and that's where the peer pressure element comes in and all these things. So it's like dialing that relationship up, much more intensely. But the dynamics at play are something that all of us can kind of relate to. And I think that's what we're hoping to kind of uncover in this story, that I think you're gonna find as people tell their stories, which as I've done, that instead of them kind of coming to some sort of understanding, which is what I initially intended. Like, I wanted to own this part of my life so that we can talk about it. You can feel comfortable asking me. So hopefully we can all learn from this. But what I didn't expect, and what I've learned in telling the story so many times, as I got better at telling it, people would be looking at me like any good story. You're hoping a person self-reflects. And when a person starts coming back to me going, wait, it sounds like you're describing the relationship I have with my dad or my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my boss or my coach.
Right.
And that's when I started to really realize that this is a universal experience. We're on a spectrum. We as cult survivors are kind of towards that extreme version of one spectrum. But most of us encounter these one-on-one relationships that, because we don't properly identify the abuse that goes on and label it correctly, it's just like anything. If you don't get the proper diagnosis, you can't get the medicine. You don't heal.
Right.
And you unfortunately start this cycle potentially of these unhealthy, because you can get out of that relationship. Most people got to get to a point like, I got to get out. But by not healing or identifying or recognizing there needs to be some recovery from the trauma, you start this cycle of repeating that type of relationship over and over again. And then we all have had stories of how we just seem to pull these really unhealthy people in our lives. Like, how does this keep happening? Mm-hmm. And this hopefully will help explain some of that.
Break the pattern, break the chain.
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting because the guest that we have coming on our third episode, Nixie, who was in my cult with me, I was actually in charge of her. Mm-hmm. Thank God we're still friends after escaping around the same time. I really had to, I didn't have to coax her to come on, but I had to say, talk about what you want to talk about. Yeah. I will, put the ball in your court. I'll take over if you're not comfortable, because she really wants to talk about it.
Yeah.
But she's afraid of feeling judged or the backlash. And even though her and I have talked about this for the last 10 years, to finally say it publicly, she was like, whoa, let me think about that.
No, it's challenging.
It is challenging.
I think it's counterintuitive in the sense that if you had a part of your life that was really, really difficult, the typical thing is to not burden someone with it.
Correct.
Or try to spin it some way positive so that you can just say it was for the best. But the truth is, if you haven't really dealt with the trauma, which is hard to do because it is painful, but the way it's best dealt with is talking about it. And I can start initially in therapy or with friends or whatever, but ultimately the real growth, my experience has been, is having the courage to kind of own that
Me
story.
too. Me too.
And Brene Brown talks about this exhaustively, which I love her writing. She basically says, that shame is one of the most awful things that we experience. And the antidote to it is vulnerability. And one of the greatest ways to be vulnerable is to tell your story. And
it empowers you.
It does. But you do come up against some people who are resistant to it because they're uncomfortable with you being vulnerable. But I find that's a great litmus test to find out who you want in your life and who you don't. We all don't have to have a million friends. And if I have the courage to volunteer something that is definitely a vulnerable thing that I experienced, and just even the labels and whatever around it sound hard, if I'm being judged by that, then that's probably not someone I need in my life. But what the normal reaction I get is people feel incredibly supportive and kind, and actually a lot of times they now feel safe to reveal something about their life.
Right.
They said, I've never told anybody this, but now that I've offered up the cult bomb, and when that's on the table, they're like, well, that doesn't sound that anything compared to what I went through. I've been harboring this secret, and I end up sometimes having incredible conversations with people that are strangers just because I've had the courage to kind of just own this part of my life. I don't want to be defined by it, but it's a part that I want to talk about.
Right. Well, it reminds me of a funny story and something you and I have talked about, and actually Nixie's going to talk about on her episode, which we were laughing so hard about. It's finding that sweet spot too, because when I first left the cult and started talking about it, it'd be like, hi, I'm Chele, and I was in a cult. Like, I felt the need to overshare, which was part of my cult, because we had to confess our sins every day. And you had to talk about the nitty gritty, or you were in secret sin. It was like such a part of our culture. Yeah. Confess your sin to publicly, in front of the church, people, your personal discipler that was in charge of you every day, confess your sin. And I didn't know how to stop doing that.
Yeah.
And so Nixie and I were talking, and when we started to date normal men outside of the group, because we could only date in the group, we both basically married strangers, literally in the group. Even on dates, I'd be like, well, I should probably tell you, I was in a religious cult for 17 years. I'm very socially awkward. And that date was over, man. It was like, we're done.
But, that's very similar to what the alcoholic or drug addict goes through as far as the recovery process. There's that confessional part of where because usually when you're in those states, and I certainly know for me, I didn't tell anybody I was in this group if I didn't feel they were safe. So I kept it all. So I just felt like I was hiding and lying to a lot of people.
When you were in it.
When I was in it. Right. So for me coming out of it and wanting to be transparent.
The freedom to say it.
I went to the other extreme. I'd hop in a cab and I'd tell the guy, it's like, yeah, I need to go to, 54th and 3rd. Did I tell you I was in a cult? Yeah. No, really. 15 years. And I would be like, having to vomit it out just because I'd spent so many years putting
Hiding
up camouflage,
Right.
and becoming a master of that kind of
Right.
hiding, that I said, I don't care what they think, but I'm going to own it. And then eventually you find your way into
You find that sweet spot.
You find your way into the middle.
A need to know basis.
Yeah, because the shock value only works so well.
But don't you find that most people are fascinated by it?
Well, yeah. Well,
I've had great friends just wanting to hear my story. Yeah,
they find that they can't believe you volunteered it, and then they want to know more, and then they're like, "Are you okay? Can I talk
can of worms?
Yeah,
it is a can of worms.
But it's that's hopefully like shows like this can make it more easy, and realize it doesn't.
And that fast forward to why we are here.
Mm-hmm.
It's having it all, I think, packaged up in a platform where we can share what needs to be shared, in a controlled fashion. And that's probably what I'm most excited about.
And a safe environment.
And a safe environment.
Because anyone we're talking to, there's no judgment going on because we went through the same thing.
Right.
Different version. But
it's a club. It's definitely a club. The Cult Survivor Club.
Yeah, I don't recommend everyone.
Don't want to be a part of that club, but
like I said, everyone's had some form of a cultic relationship. So we're kind of all in this.
That's a great point.
And so
damn big club.
And from that point of view, the recovery steps that we had to do just to kind of reintegrate back into the world, those same techniques can be useful to anybody.
But it took years.
Yeah. It doesn't happen overnight.
It does not happen overnight.
And I think that's one of the hard things to face is when you finally have swallowed the pill. And it's been interesting in my group where there have been such a resistance to facing the truth. Because again, you're avoiding the trauma, but you're also having to look at your life in this sense of going back to whenever the first moment was when you interacted with this group, for me, it was the leader. I met the leader when I was 16 on the beach with my family vacations. I mean, that random. But that moment, my life took a tangent that affected me for the next, 25, 30 years.
Yeah.
So you have to go back to that moment with this new lens of saying, you know what? At that point, I started to be manipulated and on some level influenced.
Yeah. And
start to readdress my life with that new lens, reframe it. And that is so intimidating because for some people, like, the members of my group, you're talking about 25, 30 years, they don't want to go there. They want so it's the key component to that is humility. Do you have the humility to say, look, I got taken. I got conned on some level, which happens to us constantly all day. But when you get something like that of that weight, it's amazing how many people just don't have the humility. And it's just because it sounds always, it's just too big of a pill to swallow. But like anything, when you actually start to deal with it, it's never as bad as you thought when you were avoiding it.
And like you said, most people find that a strength to be able to talk about it, and it's very endearing.
Yeah.
Like I felt, the first time we met, I felt so close to you in 5 minutes. I just knew you were very authentic. Who you were was what you were. And you just said it. And I was like, oh, God, I found a best friend,
Well, I mean, it's something that I look at, and I talk about the silver linings. I think if I had been a cocaine addict or some sort of, I could recognize other cocaine addicts. Right? You can see the tells.
Yeah.
And this whole crazy experience that I've lived through has given me a kind of radar for sensing when someone's in an abusive relationship. Like I can feel it on them from the way they move, the way they hold themselves. There's this kind of lack of self-esteem. And obviously at that moment, it's probably not appropriate to get into it per se. But if I can just show that person, because more often than not, it's a stranger, right?
Yeah.
Just show them some kindness, and be tender at that moment. It's just, I'm just happy that I can see it rather than be oblivious like probably everyone else is. So there's lots of powerful takeaways from this experience. I mean, we can't not deny what's going on in the world today. I mean, there's so much influence and control. I mean, I would go on record to probably say people are having a cultic experience with the way COVID's been handled. There's a lot of fear and things being dressed to such an extreme that people end up in. It's polarizing. So
same with politics.
Yeah, whenever things are black and white, you're usually dealing with cultic aspects. And so it's I'm grateful that I have that lens. And I don't tell people that for them to go through what I went through, but it's given me some really valuable life lessons.
Right. Well, and I want to circle back. I was going to kind of frame the rest of the episode for everyone who's listening, but I do want to underscore the fact that with college students, I think all parents need to know this, and they need to prepare their children for all sorts of indoctrination on campus.
I mean, I wish we could find ways, and I'm looking into it right now, of putting something in the curriculum.
Yes, or there'd be a class, like the welcome class.
It's almost like it's a class in common sense of learning how influence techniques works, manipulation tactics, mind control, all these things. Whether you're just being manipulated in sales,
Right.
There's this great book called Influence by what's his name? The guy out of Arizona State, Robert Cialdini, and he talks about all the ways influence kind of affect the way we, just get used or taken advantage of in life, because we're taught to socialize in a certain way, and the way we socialize is taking shortcuts. So if you're taught, like, if someone's nice to you, you should be nice back to them, you don't realize that you can be manipulated by that tactic.
Right.
And one of the examples he gives, which is a very simple one, is he says if you put one hand in hot water and one hand in cold water and put them both in lukewarm water, this hand thinks it's hot, this hand thinks it's cold. The water's the same temperature. So in the same way, he said, if I'm in sales, what I would do is what would be more important is the second question I ask you, because the first question is going to check your temperature. So the example he gives is, at one point they were trying to help out a child delinquent problem in a little town. And so they went out to the people and they said, listen, would you take the kids, these teenagers to the zoo for the weekend? And everyone's like, no, I don't want to take these delinquents. Like, a really, really poor result. They went back to the same area 3 weeks later, and this time asked them two questions. The first question was, we're trying to put together an organization that can look after these kids, maybe come up with ideas. It'll be like, we'll meet like once a month, only probably be a couple of years, and we can help eliminate this problem. People are like, I don't even know where I'm going to be in 2 years. I can't commit this. And they're like, well, could you just at least take them to the zoo for a weekend? And now 6 times as many people say yes. Because if we're taught, if we've used up our no and the person seems to be amenable and kind of be trying to work with us, we feel an obligation to work, even though that may not be something we want to do.
Correct.
And that's something that is an unconscious reaction that people use in recruitment and indoctrination techniques all the time.
Well, it's a classic sales technique.
Yeah,
I took a class on all the different sales techniques, and that one works.
So you can teach kids that, so that they would learn and have a couple more red flags available to them. Because just like the idea of, we'll talk about love bombing, feeling good too quickly should be a red flag. But usually we're so needing to feel good that anyone who treats us that way, we're so excited that we don't recognize it could be a form of manipulation. Mm-hmm. We just get pulled in.
Well, and I think with college students, just even putting that on the forefront of their mind, that people are going to come along and be real nice to you and offer this and offer that, because then when that context is there, they can at least look at it more critically and go, okay, I heard this was going to happen. Right. Instead of thinking what I thought, God sent these people to me. If I would have known, no, it wasn't God. It was their leader who set them out with a quota to meet for the day on how many people to share their faith with.
Right.
I wish I would have known that up front than thinking it was some cosmic power bigger than me. Right? So I just wanted to restate that about the college students because, again, I was one of the people out there preying on them on the campus. I wish they would have been warned about me.
And I think that's one of the challenging parts of the recovery. If you've been a recruiter, and I was one as well, unconsciously.
But hold on. I was a very good recruiter. At one service, I had 20, we called them visitors, 20 visitors with me, the whole row.
Wow.
So I got away with a lot in my cult, I think, because I was very effective. So they kind of turned a blind eye when I was a little, mavericky.
Well, I was giving them a lot of money, so that bought me
You
a lot.
were giving them, and how much? 5 million? Just say it.
Yeah, upwards. It's hard to look back at it all. It was in the
Around.
80s and 90s, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well,
not chunk change.
Definitely not chump change. And you'll bring that in a minute when you tell your story and where that money came from and all of that. So we're going to frame each episode with 3 questions for most of our guests. We'll have a few of the experts we might not do that with, but because there's so much that we could talk about, and because we could go on so many tangents, or we'll go down a on a very juicy story, and I'll speak for myself, I get off track because something will ping in my brain and then I run down a different road. So what we're going to try to do is stick to these 3 main questions for each of our guests to really frame how this all happened. And the 3 questions are, number 1, how did it happen? Number 2, why did you stay? Subtext, why didn't you leave? And number 3, how did you heal from the trauma and not feel like a victim? Or maybe they're still working on that, quite frankly. But before I kind of officially pass the ball back over to Hoyt, because I'm sure you're all dying to hear his story, as I love hearing it every single time. But one thing I wanted to point out was just a few stats that when I left my group, these stats in and of themselves were like therapy for me to hear the stats. So the international stats on cults, there are over 10,000 cults around the world. 10,000 that we can name and call them a cult. As Hoyt so eloquently mentioned, we're basically dealing with cultic relationships all day, every day when we give our power away, or we're dealing with controlling people or abusive relationships or what have you. But think about that for a second. 10,000 cults.
And a lot of them are less than 50 members, so they're virtually invisible to society.
Correct.
So obviously we know some big ones, and those are, so when you hear that number, I think it's important to qualify it, that most of them can be, I know I met these women that had been in a knitting group that became a cult. So, I mean, you never know what form it can take, you know?
Right, that's true. Or MLMs.
Oh, yeah.
You know, those are, there's that great doc out now. Yeah. So we'll frame it around 10,000, varying in size. Our group got up to 150,000 people around the world. It was in every major city. It is, even after a pretty big fallout that my cult had and a splinter effect, it's still at 128,000 people. That's enough people to cause a problem.
Yeah,
in my opinion. So the other stat that really just floored me and helped me in the sense of, I don't know if it's the misery loves company effect or just feeling like I wasn't alone. That's a better way to say it. I knew I wasn't alone when I read time and time again that 1 out of 8 people on our planet will either indirectly or directly be affected by cultic activity in their lifetime. We are almost at 8 billion people on the planet. That's 1 billion people will be affected by a cultic relationship or cultic activity, however you want to say that. That is a lot of people. That is why I come across someone that has had a cultic experience, dare I say, almost once a day. It's just becoming a common conversation I'm having in my life. Again, another reason why I was really excited to get together with Hoyt and to just frame this conversation and just say, let's just get our hands dirty and talk about it.
Well, it's not easy. It's very easy to see how it happens. I call it the ripple effect. I mean, when I went down this road of getting involved in this group, not only did I recruit some friends into it, but my other friends and family, they were all involuntarily taken on this journey with me. You know, it's like having a drug addict in the family. You know, it's like
affects everybody.
You're observing someone who's clearly being influenced. In this case, it was a group, not a drug, but being influenced to do very self-destructive and self-sabotaging behavior.
Right.
And you feel powerless to stop them.
Right.
You suffer a pretty deep wound. And I think that's one of the harder parts of the recovery process, is not only doing your own work to try to get your own act together and make sense of this experience, but then you're also observing all your friends and family who got wounded in this process, and more often than not haven't dealt with that wound.
Right.
And so as you're trying to get your act together, you're starting to observe them being in that wounded state and generally not wanting to talk about it, because the human nature aspect of it is that everyone blames themselves on some level that they could have done more, they should have done more, which is where the wound comes from. And only by getting information can you see, like, in that situation, everyone more or less behaved the way we didn't know what we were dealing with. We didn't know how cults worked. It was nobody's fault. It really is like that moment in Good Will Hunting where you just say,
Yep.
it's not your fault, but you can't do the healing for someone else. And I think that's one of the challenging parts of the recovery process is you want so much to become whole again in your own way, but you also see the wounds in others who you love, who got harmed in this process. And that's where, this thing affects most people. And that's why I say getting the information out and realizing on some level that they probably themselves have had a cultic relationship, that there's not such a wide gap between what I went through and what they've gone through allows a bridge so we can talk about it, and then a lot of healing can take place.
Right.
But that's not easy to do.
Yeah. It takes years.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. Okay, so before Hoyt shares his story, the last thing I wanted to say right here is that, and again, this was also very helpful for me to learn, thought reform formula for all cultic relationships is very similar. The tactics, the tools, and there's some main kind of anchors that recruiters use. Funny part is I didn't know I was using these. I was taught them.
Right.
It wasn't until I got out when I went, oh, that's what I was doing. So, which I want to talk about really quick. But if you think about no matter what the cult is, it doesn't matter if it's Jim Jones, fundamentalist Mormon, Charles Manson, an MLM, an abusive relationship. I mean, New Age cult. I mean, we could go on about all the different types of cults. Even the Nazis, when they were interviewed, used these tactics. So many different abusive relationships that do this. But if you're using the same war chest, the same tools, the same tactics, but yet your group is so different, I like to say that it's the same party, just a different costume. Because it's the same thing that's happening to the mind in your life, in your relationship. We're just all wearing different costumes. Hoyt's costume and his cult was much different than mine.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But we were experiencing the same thing. So when we talk about things quite often, we'll go, oh my gosh, we did that too. You use that word? We use that word all the time. You know, you're full of pride. You're this, you're that. There's so many universal, I think, dialogue even amongst cults. But the two that I want to highlight before I pass the baton back to Hoyt here is Hoyt mentioned love bombing. That is a universal, upfront, cultic relationship tool. The accolades, the you're special, the no one's really known how awesome you are your whole life. Come to this group. We will remind you every day how great you are. But that really only happens in the beginning, just like with an abusive relationship. And I saw it. I was recently watching one of J-Lo's movies, Enough. Remember that movie, Enough?
Yeah,
She
it's
was,
been a while. I haven't seen it.
she was in an abusive relationship, and her husband, well, boyfriend, then husband, was so charming in the beginning and showered her with gifts and just loved her, and she was living this fairy tale. But then something happened one day, and the switch was flipped, and he became a monster. And she saw who he really was, right? But then she's in so deep. They have a child. She's stuck. She has no access to the bank accounts. She has no job. He's threatening her. You know, all these things are happening. So you think about that. I'm like, that's what I felt like I went through. So whether it's one man or 150,000 people with the group I was in, it was just so universal, which I found fascinating. So people need to watch out for love bombing. Like you said, when you feel too good too fast, something's probably a little...
Potential red flag.
Pay attention.
Yeah.
Pay attention. Look for the signs. And then the second one that we'll talk about throughout probably every podcast as well is just good old simple blackmail, whether it's called collateral or an e-meter where you confess all your sins, or we had sin lists that we had to write out before we were allowed to get baptized. There's usually some sort of blackmail going on. And those are the two, I would say, anchors that I have seen in almost everybody I've talked to that has survived some sort of cultic relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, would you agree with that, Hoyt?
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down to power and control, right? And money usually is in there somewhere if they can find it.
Right. There's plenty.
But it's when you look at Lifton's 8 tenets of this guy Robert Lifton,
right,
studied the during I
Thought
think
reform.
the Korean War, right? I think it was.
I think you're right.
With he came out with a book called, I guess it was called Thought Reform.
Thought Reform, yeah.
But he basically analyzed the Chinese indoctrination techniques because some of our best soldiers were not only signing confessionals against America,
Right.
but then becoming Korean citizens. And they're like, what is going on over there? And just doing that work that he did, those 8 tenets can basically, we'll go through them in another episode, but there you see them in virtually every group. It's like every cult leader gets the cult leader handbook. There isn't one, but it's just kind of the way the pathology plays out,
right?
And it's really extraordinary. And so I think in listening to these episodes coming forward, you'll start to see recurring themes, and we're hoping
patterns.
Yeah, hope that will be one of the purposes we're doing this. Is sometimes you need to hear things more than once to kind of let it take root. But there's going to be a lot of commonalities, and I think that's good to reinforce, because that's how you know what to look for, and that's how you go, oh, I can relate to this, because I certainly felt that way, and I've certainly been in a relationship where that's happened. And so,
what's the saying? Knowledge is power. Is that the saying?
That's right. That's what. Yeah, it is.
Right.
And with great power comes great responsibility, says Spider-Man.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, so without further ado, drum roll, please. Hoyt's got such a great story, so I'm really excited for you all to hear it. But Hoyt, so you're the first one that gets to try to do this by following our 3 questions. So let's see if even the hosts can manage this great feat.
Well,
I put upon you.
Well, what's our time right now? Just so I have
KT.
an idea.
About
Okay.
10 minutes.
All right.
By the way, I am going to embarrass her, KT, who is our producer, director, production manager, friend. I will at some point force her to put her face in front of the camera and say hello to you guys. So if we refer to KT, that's who it is. She's the production extraordinaire.
All right. Well, when it comes to my story, it's a story that you can easily research, because I've been talking about this for 2 decades now. So I'll try to keep my retelling of it to more broad strokes, because that way we can get on to other people's stories. And then through talking to other survivors, I'm sure I'll add anecdotes that I can relate to, like you will.
Right.
So the perfect storm is what I like to refer to as kind of how it happens, of like, where was I in my life? And this is where the context is so important. Like, it's not only important to talk about where you were in your life, but also what was going on in the world at the time. So for me, when I met the cult leader at 16 on the beach of Nantucket, which is where my family summered every summer, and if I had one word to describe Nantucket, it was just safe, because small island, a little bubble, mostly white people, kind of, quite affluent, at least, doing well. And it was something that you just thought, there's not a traffic light in the entire island. So it was just kind of a very kind of smaller, safe. And when you were 8 or 10 years old, your parents could let you run through town because nothing bad could happen to you. So there's virtually no crime, whatever. So when this guy sits down next to me, the last thing I think is someone could be dangerous, and
you were 16.
Well, sure.
So
but I mean, it was also a time when, if this is like the late 70s, where there was generally a pushback on traditional religions. People weren't really into the real Christian sin and guilt type things. So there were a lot of people looking into alternative things. So that was, and at 16, I did not consider myself remotely religious, but I did not really buy into what I'd been exposed to, which was the idea of going to church, seeing my dad, put money in a till, and then having someone more or less tell us, these are the things you need to look about, your sins or whatever. But if the fact you've come here, you get a clean slate, go back and have a good week, just come back next week. And I'm like, that's BS. Like, there was no accountability for what you did. You just had to keep coming back every week, put the money in the till, and get a clean slate. I'm like, So when this guy sits down to me next to me on the beach. His name was Frederick von Meers.
Wait, what was it? Freddie?
Well, Freddie Myers was his real name, but he was going by Frederick von Meers.
Oh, that's right.
So he changed his name. That's a whole nother part of the story that I don't know if I'll be able to get into. But he had gone. Anyone who leads these groups is someone who's gone through some trauma early in their life, where they're now developing a coping mechanism, which is why they're manipulating everyone. It's their way to kind of get back the power that they felt they lost when they were very young. So he had reinvented himself as this guy. He was Freddie Myers, Jewish guy from Brooklyn. He was now Frederick von Meers from Dutch descent, social register that I'd never even heard of, but that's what he was all into. And he starts talking about Eastern philosophy and astrology and ancient civilizations. I mean, things that I was always interested in, but not something I'd like tell my buddies about. So the most impressive thing was he was speaking to me like an adult. He was probably in his mid-30s at that point. And I had heard about him from my other friends because they had talked about, there's this really kind of wild guy, kind of like a flashback from the 60s. He talks about all this stuff, but he was considered harmless. So again, I had kind of had him vetted to some degree by my friends. And so when he sat down and talked to me and basically engaged me, I basically listened for an hour. And he used techniques that, looking back on it, were very effective, of saying like, oh, you're so smart, you'll understand this. And he'd go through and explain some very highfalutin idea, which I didn't understand. But when someone says that to you, you feel you can't come clean and say, I don't know what you were talking about. They're giving you a compliment and you're like, oh, I've got to at least fake that I understand. And those are very subtle manipulation techniques. And so he would just, he rode his bike around. Like I said, Nantucket was very small. I would see him from time to time around the island. He was always friendly, and he always invited me to these parties. He was having a party almost every night. And it was like, and at 16, I'm like, opportunity for free beer. So that's why I would go. And it was interesting because he didn't do like a full court press in any sense, like the way some of these groups do. It was very relaxed, and he pointed me towards some information about like Hindu Vedanta, which is some wonderfully inspirational scriptures. But ultimately, it wasn't until I got to university and I went to college in New Jersey at Princeton where I found out that when he wasn't in Nantucket, he was in Manhattan. And once he knew I was going to Princeton, he's like, oh, you must call me. You can come out with my friends. We'll go to Studio 54. And again, sounds
Studio 54,
great.
Right?
Not what you think is a cult indoctrination process. I'm like, I get to go up to Studio 54. Like, this guy's going to get me in. I can bring a friend. And he said, yeah, you can come to my apartment. You can crash. So at the beginning stages, I actually thought I was working him, and I'm taking advantage of the situation. Like I knew he was I knew he was gay. I mean, although he didn't seem to be in any way actively pursuing me, but I knew he kind of liked me and kind of, and he definitely surrounded himself by what he considered to be important or beautiful people. I mean, I have since found out from people who knew him from the time before I did that he would actually give out cards to the people that were staying with him that would have the address of his place and say, we're going to have a party tonight. Go and find the beauties, but only the beauties. And if they have a friend, tell them the friend can't come. I only want the beauties. And that
ugly friends couldn't come.
That was the way he did it. And so he definitely had this kind of, I guess you would say, pathology of he would judge himself by the people he could surround himself with. And so obviously I didn't have the understanding of that at the time. I just thought someone's giving me the attention, and I go to Studio 54 and he introduces me to these beautiful women, and I was just having the time of my life. And so that's how it started. And it really didn't shift into being something much more serious until by the time I graduated, this guy, Freddie, had a protege with him named John. And John was kind of a kid who was my age, but he was like, he could just recite scripture. He knew the Bible, he knew the Vedanta, all these sort of things. So John was kind of painted as this person who was going to become like an incarnation of God in our lifetime. And Freddie was here to train him. So when I started to hear that, I'm like, that sounds a little too much for me to believe. But then around that time, John went to a metaphysical writer named Ruth Montgomery who had like 8 or 9 very successful best-selling books about metaphysics. And she had done it through this technique of automatic typing. She would go in front of her typewriter and she'd kind of go into a trance, and then she'd type out, and then she would investigate it because she had been an investigative journalist. She had been personal press attaché to 6 presidents. I mean, she had a legit career, and then she got into this thing later in her life. And through this technique, John reaches out to her, and then she consults, as she called them, her guides. These are the people typing through her trancing. She asked the guides about Frederick, and they completely verify that he is this great teacher.
Oh, great.
So in her new book that came out in 1985 called Aliens Among Us, 4 chapters is about Freddie being this kind of,
oh no,
alien who's this high-powered, influential person. And from that, it actually shifted from being kind of this narcissist with an entourage, of which I would partake with. Then it started to become a cult, because then we had to have an office. We had 45 countries and people from all different walks of life coming through, and we had to make it into a business. So we had audio tapes. We had a cable access show where, back at those times, you could get on television. You just had to pay for it, and you could do whatever you wanted. And so we were doing that, and that's when the recruitment really kind of started. And that's the same time that I started modeling. And that's a whole nother story of how that happened.
Well, and KT just gave us the 5-minute mark.
Right.
But so I'm hoping what you could do, because right after this episode, we have your friend Dar. What's Dar's last name?
Dixon.
Dar Dixon. What a great name. And so you guys can, compare and contrast and keep going. But maybe you could give us a recap of the modeling and Princeton, because you were modeling and at Princeton, literally looking like this obviously good-looking man at Princeton playing football, right? So on the outside, all Americana family, Nantucket, Princeton, football, modeling, giving upwards of $5 million to this group. No one knew that was happening. So that is just so fascinating.
And I think that's why I've gotten a good amount of attention in telling the story, because it is counterintuitive. Because again, that image you're describing goes against what people mostly unconsciously have to face. It. They have a preconception of who they think this happens to, and then when I show up, they're like, "Wait, this happened to you? Like what?" So that helps short circuit them. And then the whole fact that I was living this very public life. As a fashion model, I was on the road 300 days a year. People were seeing me in campaigns and billboards, whatever. And the fact that whole time that's going on, I'm in a controlled cultic environment. People are like, "What?" So that's where the story gets in interest. And ultimately, for me, the more satisfying part of the story is obviously I did get away. I escaped, and I escaped in 1999. It took me 3 attempts. I got caught twice. I wasn't really smart at the way I was thinking of escaping, because again, I felt so guilt-ridden of thinking about leaving, and I'm sure you can identify with this. Like the question a lot of people, want to hear or ask, which is really inappropriate very often, is when they say, "Well, why didn't you just leave?" And people don't realize like how hurtful that is to hear that as someone who went through this experience. It's kind of like if I had the confidence to tell you in secret that. I had gotten raped when I was 21 years old.
Well, what were you wearing?
Yes, exactly.
That's the thing.
And so you feel like I did something wrong.
Yeah.
And of course, this is where you have to own the victim side of it. Like I did not sign up for I will never beat myself up for what I signed up for. Now, what it actually was something very different, which took me 20 years to figure out.
Me too.
But the thing I got pitched on was great. And that's the hard thing, and that's the process, and that's the recovery process, is to start to deconstruct all of that. And that's where Dar and I, and you'll hear later, really helped each other, because we found each other after we had both left. Dar had left like 4 or 5 years before me. We all both ended up in the same city, and by being able to reconnect, we could be able to talk to each other, because very often you feel on an island, no one's going to understand. You don't know what you've gone through. I was going through severe PTSD, and luckily I was able to find someone from the group who was willing to talk. And through that deconstruction, that's when we both came to, because I didn't leave knowing it had been a cult. I left thinking I was holding the group back. I was this dead weight that was holding them back that they were never going to give up on, but I was a lost cause in my eyes. And that's why I left.
Right.
And so that's where it's really been interesting to kind of reconnect with other cultivars and start to understand this is something that's more common than I realize. And that's why I think these stories really need to be told.
Well, and I think it'll be interesting for you to share with Dar. I'm not even sure if he knew this was happening, but you were the abuse. And we'll get into some more details, that things you've shared with me that I think it's
Dar had got plenty himself. Let me tell you,
the punishment, the abuse.
He was known as Cinderfella.
Oh my God!
You had to clean. even when we were going off to Studio 54, Dar had to clean the apartment. I mean, he was
Cinderfella.
Yeah, it was not great. Really terrible.
Well, and thank you so much, Hoyt. Again, we'll dig in more on the next one.
We want to hear your story as well.
Well, and I think what we'll do when I have my friend Nixie come on for the 3rd episode, I'll dig into mine, and then her and I can, compare and contrast. She knows me better than probably anyone on the planet, so that will be, interesting. And make sure you follow us on TikTok, WhaTheFlok. Remember, that's FLOK. Cult Survivor Stories, and Instagram at WhaTheFlok. We're doing a lot of fun stuff on there. The stories have been amazing. We're definitely keeping it light and fun because I think laughter is some of the best medicine, and it's very validating to be able to just, I think, have a silly take, or it can be a little bit too dark and twisty. So TikTok and Instagram, we're going to keep really fun, informative also. And I'm going to close this out by rereading our quote, the quote of the day, because I think it sums up perfectly what we had talked about for the last hour. The mind is your guard, the heart is your maid, and the soul is your territory. Nobody else but you should have control of these. Guard your hearts and your minds, my friends. No one should have control of these except you. And we'll see you next time.
No,